Bob Gilbert. Now, many of you will know him. He's been here before and kept us absolutely fascinated and interested. I was looking through the blurb that was on WOW and looking you up on the net, and I saw that somebody, it doesn't say that here, but somebody called you a detective of the natural world, and I really liked that because I thought that covered so much of what you've been doing, which is investigating the enigmas of the natural world, and some of these questions which are in here. Is there a population of mosquitoes in the London? I'm sure you're going to tell us, but it sounds absolutely riveting. So I'm going to hand over to you, but I'm also going to say at the beginning and at the end that Bob has just published a book in May this year, published by Scepter, called The Missing Musk, and he has brought copies with him. So at the end, you can hire it. We'll have some for those of you who'd like to buy. So just want to remind you of that, in case you whiz off. You know, don't whiz off without thinking about that. So, over to you.
Always a bad idea to clap before someone starts. Let's see if I've earned it.
It's an act of confidence.
In 1913, all the musk plants in the world stopped smelling. Here was a plant that was hugely popular, grown everywhere from country gardens to working class windowsills, and entirely for the fragrance that was reflected in its name. And yet that fragrance had suddenly and globally gone. When I first heard the story, told me by an elderly man, as we sat round his garden table in the Yorkshire Dales, I was understandably sceptical, even though he seemed to me old enough to have been there at the time. But he swore to the truth of his tale, though he could provide no explanation for it. In fact, it took only a little subsequent digging for me to substantiate the gist of what he had said. It was a plant that had once been the centre of a massive horticultural trade, but it existed in this country now only as a sporadic wetland wildflower. And in all of my plant books, the description of its once vaunted fragrance were prefixed with the puzzling word former. The juxtaposition of mystery and natural history was something I could not resist. Before I go on to read the rest of the 310 pages of the book, let me say thank you for inviting me. I too am glad you've not all gone to the park or whatever. I think it would have been a bit lonely had you done that. So thank you for inviting me back. As you heard, I was here a year ago. I was talking on the subject of rewilding, listening to. I happened to mention at that time that I've got a book coming out this year, so here I am, and here's the book. Incidentally, the idea of all rushing to the coronet, by the way, if there's a fire alarm, I love that too. Did you ever do drills? You could do a practice run if you like. And the other thing I'm going to say is, the last time I spoke, I'm sure I was at that end of the room. So it's very disconcerting for me that you've spun the whole thing round in the years I've been gone. But enough of all that. I said at the end of that paragraph that the combination of mystery and natural history was something that I could not resist. Slight inaccuracy there, because I actually resisted for 30 years. After hearing that story, life, work, children, the washing up, even a couple of other books intervened, and it was 30 years before I got round to writing it. But there was an advantage to that, which was that during that time, having been alerted to this kind of mystery of the missing musk, I was alert to other enigmas of the natural world, and I began to collect them. And I don't mean the kind of stories like the Loch Ness Monster or the Yeti or the Black Dog of the Devon Black Dog or the Bodmin Beast. I mean things that were scientifically attested but were not yet explained. I was interested in what you might call the extraordinary in the everyday. So I began to accumulate mysteries like the Blandford Black Fly, the self-anointing hedgehog, Stoke funerals, all sorts of stories like that. Now, I'm going to reveal later which 6 I chose from them to put in the book, and I'm going to tell you about one of those stories in more detail. But I want to begin by just telling you one element of the title story, The Missing Musk, because in the course of writing about that I came across a fascinating character called David Douglas, and this story really illustrates how one mystery actually leads into another. You never quite get to the end. Right? You answer one thing and then it opens a whole new question. So, the musk. The musk flower, Mimulus muscatus. It's a little undistinguished creeping plant with yellow flowers. Gardeners amongst you will know probably some other plants in the genus Mimulus. You might know Mimulus luteus or Mimulus guttatus, collectively known as the monkey flowers. Little upright plants with large throats and large flowers in the throat, spotted and blotched with all sorts of interesting colours. And I have some of these growing in my window box right now. So you might know the monkey flowers, but Mimulus muscatus is not nearly as distinguished as these. As I say, it's a little sprawling flower. Its one great virtue was that it had this intense fragrance, enough, some people said, to scent out a whole room. And this plant, its native range was the area we now know as northwest United States of America and southwest British Columbia in what is now Canada. And the man who collected it there was this guy, David Douglas. Now, sitting perhaps in a suburban garden with a neatly mown lawn and those trimmed edges, sipping your Pims, looking out to the herbaceous border, properly weeded with its wonderful collection of shrubs, it is hard now to envisage the difficulties, the dangers, the hardships that the great plant collectors of the past went through to assemble that kind of group of plants and shrubs that we have. And David Douglas was just one such of those people. He walked or rode, but mostly walked hundreds of miles. In fact, he's credited with walking the entire breadth of the United States, it wasn't the United States then, the entire breadth of America from the from the Pacific to the Atlantic coast. And on the way, he went through forests, he crossed mountain ranges, he canoed rivers, capsizing several times. He waded across torrents, he dealt with bears, he met sometimes hostile local people, and he went through all this to collect this whole variety of plants. Among the plants he collected, I've jotted some of them down here, some of the ones you may be familiar with. He collected species of lupin, delphinium, honeysuckle, potentilla, phlox. Do you know the silk tassel bush, Garrya elliptica, beautiful bush. Those lovely decorations on. He brought that back to this country. The snowberry, which I don't think is quite so attractive. The snowberry was one of his. I went to a baptism recently, and as we left, we were all given seeds of baby blue eyes. Baby blue eyes is another plant he brought back to this country. He made also enormous contributions. He shaped, in fact, to the forestry service in this country, because he brought back 11 species of conifer, among them the Sitka spruce, which is now the most widely planted tree in the country, among them the Douglas fir, which is named after him, which is the tallest tree in this country. So he made these enormous contributions, and on these difficult and arduous journeys he would sit down in his tent at the end of every day and he would write up a journal. And one of the greatest pleasures for me of researching this book was that the journal still exists, and I went to the headquarters of the Royal Horticultural Society in Vincent Square, down into their archives where everything's at a controlled temperature. You have to put a pullover on even in the middle of summer to keep warm. And they brought out these journals for me, and they laid them on cushions. And I was hoping they would give me white silk gloves. That was just in my imagination, but I was actually able to turn over and read these scrawled journals that he'd written at the end of every day. But what I found out about David Douglas, not in the journals, but was that he met a mysterious and possibly murderous end. At the end of his second great journey across the United States, sorry, I keep saying the United States, it wasn't then, across America, he stopped on the way back on the Sandwich Islands, the islands which are today known as Hawaii, but then the Sandwich Islands. And because his boat was delayed, and being the man he was, he thought, well, I might as well just walk the length of the island while I'm waiting. So he did this walk right across the length of Hawaii. On the way one day he stayed with a man called Edward or Ned Gurney, and Gurney was an escaped convict. He had escaped from Botany Bay in Australia. He made his way to the Sandwich Islands, and he was making his living as a hunter of wild cattle. And the way you hunted the wild cattle was you dug great pits and you waited for the cattle to fall into them. Sorry, you covered the pits with brush, I should say, and then when the cattle fell in, you went and shot it. It seemed a rather one-sided contest to my way of thinking. And according to Gurney's account, in the morning, Douglas was keen to get going. Gurney tried to persuade him to wait for one of the local guides, but he wouldn't. This is what Gurney said. Gurney said, I'd started him off on his journey. I pointed out where the cattle traps were, and I left him to it. Later that day, some local people passing one of the cattle traps heard a noise from within and looked through the brush, and there was a large bull standing on the body, the gored body of David Douglas. This is the man who brought you your Garrett lips, your baby blue eyes, and all these things. So they called for Gurney. Gurney shot the bull, and they took the body out and they sent it to the missionary station at Hilo, which is where Douglas had been on his way to at the time. The missionaries looked at the body and thought the wounds were not entirely consistent with having been gored by a bull. So they packed the body in salt and they sent it on to the consul. The consul did brief investigations, and it was passed off as an accident. But after that, all sorts of doubts have begun to emerge. There is still the debate about the nature of the wounds on the body. Someone attested, who'd seen him a few days earlier, that the money in his bag after he died was not the same amount as the money in his bag before that morning. And quite recently, papers emerged in the Edinburgh Botanic Gardens, that's where the papers were found, suggesting that Gurney's wife had developed romantic feelings for David Douglas. So, the question is, did he fall or was he pushed? Or perhaps was he killed and then thrown into the pool to disguise it? So you can see what started for me, I write about natural history. You know, what has started as an botanical investigation actually turned into this murder mystery. In fact, there are two in the book, because in another chapter I come across another suspected foul play. So that was fascinating for me. In the rest of that chapter, I have to say, I go on to investigate, can we really kind of recover what that smell of musk might have been like? I go out to look for musk as a wildflower and find it in this country. I asked the question of did it really stop smelling quite as abruptly as the stories suggest, and of course to seek out the reason why it did stop smelling. Now, if Ian Rankin was standing in front of you today, you would not be asking him to give you the denouement of his latest detective thriller, so I'm afraid I'm not going to tell you the solution to the missing musk. Although, as you heard, I do have a stock of books in my bag. But I will leave you with this enigmatic thought about it, which is sometimes what you need is not so much the answer as to reframe the entire question. And I'll just leave you with that thought. Right, as I said, all these stories I collected, and perhaps there's enough even for a second book, but all these stories I chose 6 to put in this book. As well as the musk, there is the story of the yew. 73% of all our large and ancient yews in this country are found in churchyards. Why is that? The theories that have been given for that vary from the historical to the downright mystical. That's what I wanted to unravel, and in doing that I had the great joy of visiting yews all around the country, Tandridge and Gowbridge and Totteridge, up into Scotland to see the oldest tree in the country at Fortingall, to Kingley Vale. If you do go to Kingley Vale in Sussex, if you ever can, it's an ancient yew wood and has the most incredible feeling of silence and darkness about it. So that was the yew. The story of star jelly. Star jelly is a mysterious globule of jelly which appears sometimes singly and sometimes in great amounts scattered all over a wide area. It's called star jelly. It's been known about for hundreds of years, and in earlier years it was associated with meteorites. That's how it got the name star jelly. But still, we don't know exactly what it is. But I found it once on a family picnic. So it came from up anywhere. So star jelly, what is star jelly? That's in there. As you've heard, mosquitoes. There is purportedly a population of mosquitoes living entirely in the dark on the London Underground. Is that true, or is it an urban myth? And if it's true, how do they survive down there, and how do they evolve to that form of life? So the mosquitoes, you can ask me about some of these in the questions, because I haven't got time to talk about all of them. And then there's a creature called the tardigrade, which is a microscopic, on the large end of microscopic, but a microscopic creature which is ubiquitous. You will find it in the gutters of this very building. But the tardigrade can withstand the most extreme conditions, survive great pressure, great heat, submergence in toxic substances, all sorts of things, which has led some serious astrophysicists to suggest that it actually arrived with us from outer space. So that's the question I set out to investigate there. Are the aliens already among us? And there was one more, and that's the one I'm going to tell you about a bit more, and that's the story, that's a question about the lichen. And I'm going to tell you about that one because the ending is more open-ended. Am I making a bit of noise here as I...
Yes. It's not you. It's rowdy.
Mike's rubbing against your shirt.
Or is it another mic?
Is that...
It's fine. Carry on, carry on.
Shall I carry on? Can you imagine it's the distant rumbling of thunder? We're going to have rain again. Okay. So I was going to tell you about the lichen because it's a more of an open-ended story. You know, if I tell you the conclusion, it doesn't ruin the story. But also because it leads to some amazing conclusions, and also because it illustrates really this idea that every answer leads to further questions. So I'm going. I don't have slides, but I do have visual aids. Well, one visual aid. This is lichen. I collected this stick on the Black Isles in Scotland years ago, and I loved it so much I brought it back on a train. So it is beginning to disintegrate. But all these different growths are different forms of lichen. You don't have to go to Scotland to find it. All you have to do is step out of the front door here and look. As I walked here, I thought I'd find the nearest source of lichen for you. Look at the Norway maples along the road here, and the green, scaly coating on their bark is another species of lichen. There are 15,000 species of this organism, and it comes in a great variety of forms: fibrous, scaly, powdery, leafy, crusty. It also comes, and one of the reasons I love it, it comes in this amazing range of colours: lemon, lime, orange, ivory, grey, apple green, and it's found all over the world, in every continent of the world, and in every sort of terrain: mountains, seaside rocks, tombstones, walls, tree bark, of course, and even on pavements. There is one species that grows on the pavement, incidentally, which is called the chewing gum lichen. It looks just like pressed down chewing gum. And I occasionally used to play a game with my children when they were younger, walking down the street, working out which was the lichen and which was the chewing gum. It was a game which did not keep them entertained for a great period of time. But anyway, that's what we did. Now, botanists are not particularly known for their sense of humour or their comic timing. But there is a joke that botanists have. It wouldn't go down at the comedy style. It's roughly this question: what is a lichen? Answer: anything studied by a lichenologist. And it illustrates the mystery that I want to talk about with the lichen, which is, what exactly is it? Because scientists have debated, in fact they've argued for 200 years over the exact nature of this organism. And they've not just argued, they've got quite aggressive, quite vituperative, quite abusive with each other over what is a lichen. And it's not just an academic question either, because the answer to this question actually questions our concept of evolution. It questions the nature of species. It even raises the question of whether I can really consider myself an I at all. So, during the early years of the study of lichens, people came up with all sorts of ideas of what it might be. They thought it might be an algae, or or a fungi or a moss, or they invented a special group for it, a kind of hybrid thing called the musco fungi, a hybrid between a fungus and a moss. They thought they might be mosses which had never properly grown up, or a plant that in some way degenerated. They even thought that they was something self-generated, that they were created by the action of sunlight on water. And then, significant point in the story of the algae, of the lichen, in 1829, a German physician someone by the name of Frederick Walton, makes this interesting discovery. And what happens is, he's dissecting a lichen under a microscope, and he works out that it's actually made of two different sorts of cells. There are long fibrous cells which make up the main body of the organism, but dotted along the side, inside this, is a row of green cells. It might seem a small detail, but it's going to have huge consequences. In fact, a later lichenologist, a woman called Annie Lorraine Smith, said, "There have been few subjects of botanical investigation that have roused as much speculation and such profound controversy." Walton believed that these green cells were the sexual organs, so he named them gonidia, from the same root as gonorrhea and gonads and so on. And this idea that these were the sexual organs of the lichen persisted, it was the orthodoxy, for another 40 years, until on the 10th of September 1867, a man called Simon Schwendener gets up to read a paper at the annual general meeting of the Swiss Natural History Society. Now, I've rather a soft spot for Simon Schwendener. He was a very unassuming, simple man. He was the oldest son of a farmer in a Swiss village, and as such, he was expected to take on running the family farm. Instead, he had a real passion for science, but he couldn't go to university. He didn't have the money, rather, to pay his way to university. So he became a teacher in the local village school, and in the evening, he goes to evening classes to study science. And then, eventually, he gets a very small bequest, and by dint of that, and by his ability to live very frugally, he gets himself into the University of Basel. And there, they recognise his talent, and he rises to become a professor there. And this is the stage, he's the professor at the University of Basel, when he gets up at the annual general meeting to read this paper. And in this paper, he puts forward the idea that the green cells are not the sexual organs. In fact, they are not even related to the other cells in the lichen. The fibrous cells are a fungus, the green cells are a completely different organism, an algae, and the two are living together. The algae is producing food, the fungi is providing protection. Now, this idea is actually greeted with outrage. And I just want to give you an example of the way that these scientists were talking about each other in this discovery. The president of the Natural History Society was politely sceptical of the paper. Elsewhere, it was greeted with outrage. The new Schwendenerian hypothesis was, said Lord Lindsay, merely the most recent insistence of German transcendentalism applied to science. American newspaper editor and lichenologist Henry Willey asserted that it was a theory to which no true lichenologist will be able to assent. The botanist Mordecai Cubitt Cook was confident that, even if endorsed by the 19th century, it will certainly be forgotten by the 20th. And the lichen flora of 1879 dismissed as purely imaginary, the baseless fabric of a vision. These were but mild reviews, however, compared with the vitriol that was to pour from the pen of William Nylander. He was the leading lichenologist, the great authority on lichen of the day. And he seemed to have this idea that anyone who disagreed with him was a kind of personal enemy. And of course, just such a one was Schwendener. His work, Schwendener's work, he described as absurd tales, Stultitia Schwenderiana, the product of Schwendener the simpleton. Schwendener's ideas, he wrote, scarcely deserve ever to be reviewed or castigated. So puerile are they, the offspring of inexperience and of a light imagination. The most important British lichenologist of the day was Reverend James Morrison Crombie, and where Nylander led, Crombie followed, ridiculing this sensational romance of lichenology with this unnatural union between captive algal damsel and the tyrant fungal monster. Nylander, he asserted, had convincingly reduced the Schwendenerian hypothesis to the nothingness from which it ought never to have emerged. These are the way that scientists were talking about each other. Schwendeneria the simpleton. But of course, as the years passed, more and more examples of what came to be known as symbiosis or mutualism were being discovered. Amongst the earliest discoveries, there was sea anemones, fungi, and beans. And those of you who are gardeners will know that your beans, the roots of your beans, have nodules in them, and those nodules hold a bacteria. And that bacteria is fixing nitrogen directly from the soil, or from the atmosphere, which is feeding to the plant while the plant provides it with protection. A great example, one of the early examples to be discovered of symbiosis or mutualism. So the idea of symbiosis is now accepted, and we have all sorts of different, now thousands of examples of it. But still, in evolutionary terms, it was kind of considered interesting, but a bit of a sideline, not part of the mainstream. Until the 1960s, when a woman called Lynn Margulis comes up with a fascinating idea. Now, to explain this idea, you have to come back in time with me. I kind of cue, wavy music, and then the screen goes into dissolve. Come back in time with me, if you will, to the beginning, to the early years of life on this planet. And life on this planet, we only have simple, undifferentiated cells, and these cells are forming great mats of cyanobacteria, blue-green bacteria, floating in masses on the surface of soupy seas. And for untold millions of years, nothing happens. It sounds like a very peaceful time. Nothing happens, and then suddenly, and I say suddenly in geological terms, suddenly there is this explosion of evolution, and all sorts of new forms are being produced. And this has happened because suddenly we have complex cells. We have cells which contain a nucleus and which contain other organs, or organelles as they're called. And sexual reproduction is enabled for the first time. So you get this sudden explosion of different forms, of different life forms, of different species. And how has this happened? Well, according to Lynn Margulis, it's happened as an act of symbiosis, because one of these simple cells has penetrated one of the other species of simple cell and is living within it, and together they form the complex cell. And this idea, this incidentally I should say, is the greatest act of evolution that's ever happened. The emergence of human beings from apes is trivial. It's nothing compared with this huge evolutionary step. But in my understanding, this goes even further, because it suggests that every complex cell in the universe, including every cell in your body, is the result of an act of symbiosis. And it is still one type of organism living inside another. Now, as you can imagine, like Schwendener, her ideas were ridiculed. One of my favourites is she sent off a research application, and the response was, "Your research is crap. Don't ever bother to reply again." Can you imagine sending that? "Your research is crap. Don't ever bother to apply again." When she wrote this paper, which today is regarded as seminal, it was rejected by 15 different journals before it was published. Unlike Schwendener, she wasn't unassuming. She's a very strong character, Lynn Margulis, and she said at one time, "I don't believe that my ideas are controversial. I believe that they're right." And she was right. And it was not until 1978 that she was really proved right, because then DNA analysis showed that the nucleus in a cell is of a different DNA than the rest of the cell structure. And so she was eventually vindicated. Now, this this is kind of, this study of lichen, which is going, has led to these kind of amazing ideas developing, and also it's led to a challenge to conventional neo-Darwinism, not to evolutionary theory itself, but to conventional interpretations of Darwinism. You know, the Origin of Species was published in 1859 and 1854. Sorry. And I can't read my writing. And it was very much, someone's going to correct me at the end, and it was very much a product of its time. Darwin was influenced by Malthus and by Adam Smith. Incidentally, the subtitle of his book is The Preservation of Favoured Species in the Struggle for Life. And this was the period of great imperial expansion and of rampant capitalist growth and of industrialisation. So the emphasis all around in society is on this idea of competition and the benefits of competition. It was Thomas Huxley, one of Darwin's greatest supporters, who described life as a gladiator's show whereby the strongest, swiftest and cunningest lived to fight another day. It was Tennyson who a few years later first used the terms nature red in tooth and claw. It was Herbert Spencer, who was the greatest philosopher, or the most important philosopher and sociologist of his day, who then applies these theories to society and develops an idea of social Darwinism in order to justify capitalist growth and in order, incidentally, to oppose the paying of benefits to the poor. So all this is emerging in this context, and the emphasis in neo-Darwin theory emphasis has been on competition. What Lim Margulis and symbiosis shows is that cooperation is as important a mechanism in evolution as is competition, and I think that's a great thought. But that's not the end of the story. Moving on to 2016, a man called Tony Scribbley makes another discovery. Scribbley also has an interesting backstory. He was brought up in a Montana trailer park. He was home educated within a cult. He escaped from that, got himself a job in the Montana Forestry Service. He tries to go to university but can't afford it. But because he's got some German ancestry, he manages to go free to a university in Germany, where he excels so much that he's invited back to Montana to work with the greatest expert on symbiosis of the time. So he goes back and he starts working on lichen, something called the wolf lichen, a species of lichen that occurred, that he was familiar with from his years as a forester. And when he's studying these, he discovers that there are not two species of lichen at all, there are three. As well as the fungus and the algae, there is a yeast. And then he goes and looks at all the other lichen that he can, and he finds that this applies everywhere. That there are three, not two, there are three species in a lichen. Now, to short the story a bit, this opens floodgates, because if there are three species in a lichen that have been identified, how many more might there not be? In fact, researchers in Belfast found that in a lichen there are also microfungi, there are protista, there are amoebas. There's work in Colorado which adds rotifers and tardigrades to the list. And then two Austrian microbiologists studying a thing called the tree lungwort. It's a lichen that I often search for in the book, actually, and find in Kent. But these people identified 800 different species of organisms living inside a single lichen. In other words, and Scribbley himself adds to this research, and he comes up with this idea that a lichen is not an individual. Every lichen is a single, complex, dynamic system. In an age of when pronouns seem to be increasingly important, it's not an I, it's a we. And as with the early discovery of symbiosis, this has huge implications. What we've learned from the lichen comes to be applied to all sorts of organisms. It comes to be applied everywhere. If you take a tree, for example, you can only, what you see of a tree is only 50% of the organism. 50% of it is growing underground. And that 50% in particular is growing in partnership with all sorts of lichen and microorganisms on which, mutually interdependent, on which both their lives depend. So why is it that we think of the bit above ground only as a tree? In fact, why is it that we give it, why is it we think of the tree as the dominant partner? Maybe it's the lichen, not the lichen, sorry, but it's the bacteria below that, which is the dominant partner in this relationship. And what applies to trees can be applied to human beings, as we are increasingly finding out. Try and get to the right page. What does all this say about the human? After all, like both the tree and the lichen, there is much more to us than meets the eye. The Human Microbiome Project, conducted in 2021, suggested that there are at least 10,000 species of microorganism in the human body. They occupy every part of us, from eyelashes to toenails, bacteria, fungi, archaea, viruses, phages, and micro-animals, like mice. Though we've been aware of them for some time, it's only recently that we've begun to understand their beneficial role. They boost our immunity, ward off pathogens, provide vitamins, help in digestion, and promote differentiation of cell tissue. They even affect our behaviour and our mood. Without them, in short, we would not be alive. The bacteria alone in our bodies have been estimated to number around 100 trillion. That's trillion, not billion, 100 trillion. And that means, by the way, that they outnumber the human cells in your body by a factor of at least 3 to 1, sometimes calculated as 10 to 1. We are, in short, a multitude, a we, and not a me. And my personal identity crisis is no longer existential, but biological as well. And perhaps, which is the dominant partner? In other words, is it really Bob Gilbert that's standing up to talk to you today? Or is it a massive collection of bacteria and microorganisms? I'll leave you to wrestle with that one. So, that's another. First, we have this idea that in evolution, cooperation can be as important as competition. And secondly, we have this idea we are not individuals, we are a multitude. I read that some of the most beautiful lichen in Great Britain are to be found in the ancient graveyard of the kings, the Relic Oren, on the island of Iona. So that chapter, and almost the book ends, with me travelling to Iona and standing in this really beautiful graveyard, looking at the lichens as dusk falls and the Isle of Mull in the distance begins to glimmer pink with its granite rock. Sorry, I can't too long about that. But the Iona is also the home of a worldwide ecumenical community. So it was wonderful to me to be standing in the home of this community, look at these lichen, and considering this idea that we are all of us embodied community. Not going to quite end there. I'm going to give you one more thought. When I began researching this book, I saw myself as a character from, an Agatha Christie novel, perhaps, Hercule Poirot or Miss Marple. I was going to investigate all these mysteries. I was going to go to the scene of the crime. I was going to amass evidence, collect clues. I was going to bring all the competing theories together into a kind of metaphorical drawing room. And then I was going to spin around and point the accusing finger. It's you. But I changed my mind in a way while I was writing it. I found, as I've said, that every answer, I did answer, there are answers in this book, but in a sense every answer also leads to a bigger question. You know those Chinese boxes where you open it and there's another one inside another, it's like that in reverse, it was getting bigger, one box inside another. Or those conversations you have with your child where they ask a simple question and you give a very intelligent answer and they say, why? So you give a bigger answer and they say, why? And you go on giving bigger and bigger answers, why? Until you get to God, the universe and everything. Well, it was a bit like that. Every question, every answer led to a bigger question. So in the course of writing this book, I began to respect the idea of mystery itself. Mystery as the source of both the artistic and the scientific imagination. Two realms, incidentally, which have been wrongly separated for far too long. I began to kind of develop an idea of radical uncertainty, of the importance of not knowing, or at least of humility in front of not knowing. And to me, that is the opposite to the both the religious and the scientific fundamentalism which is so prevalent today. So the task I found at the end of this book was not so much to dispel the mystery, but to go deeper into it. And let me end with a quote that's in the book, a quote from Albert Einstein. "The universe is not only stranger than we imagine, it is stranger than we can imagine." Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. Absolutely fantastic. And I just loved the last point, radical uncertainty. I thought, some of those scientists could have done with that idea, couldn't they, before they started shouting down any new idea. So, I'm sure there are lots of questions. Speaking of those people who know a bit about this, here's one.
They don't know too much.
No, but they've probably seen their life, and I'm not sure.
What happened to the poor Swiss guy?
He continued his studies. He went into new areas of research. He did all right, but he was always a rather lonely character. He had this coterie of very devoted followers. When he died, incidentally, he left everything to that village school where he'd been teaching. And then when they were going through his belongings, they found that he'd written poetry all his life. Some of it on scientific subjects, but some were love poems which expressed the idea that he wasn't actually worthy. He felt he never had enough money or was never worthy enough to get married. So it's quite a sad story, and yet he made this remarkable discovery which I think has changed the course of science. So that's why I have this kind of soft spot really for Simon Schrinder.
Could you give some more examples of cooperation rather than competition in nature? Because I think we'd all like to hear it.
But which ones spring? I mean, there's so many. Which ones spring to mind? I mean, you know, there are. If you go to larger beasts, for example, there is the oxpecker, a bird which perches on the backs of rhinoceroses and other and zebras and feeds and just picks the fleas off it, and it's benefiting from the food, and the rhinoceros is benefiting from this form of cleaning. There is a fish which swims in and out of the mouths of sharks, cleaning their teeth. There is a bird called the honey guide, which it wants to get at the honey in a tree, but it can't attack it itself. So it goes and leads a bear or something like that to the honey, and the bear will take down the honey and break it open, and then the bird will come and feed. And incidentally, humans have made use of that because the humans will follow this bird called the honey guide to take down the honey. Those are the big examples, but there are lots of smaller ones. But as ever, my mind's going a bit blank on the smaller ones. But there are. There's three anyway. That's not bad, is it?
There's another one there.
Just an observation to follow up on the point about cooperation. We are quite, as you said, a multitude of different organisms all interacting with each other. And I think it makes me think about the way we as human beings interact with the rest of the world. And it may be, something to think about, how we exist on this planet in cooperation with life around us. So I think the whole theory is enlightening, to say the least. And just one very quick supplementary question about musk. Has this got anything to do with the perfume industry?
Right. So the first point. Yes, I agree with you very much. Incidentally, I don't want to go the other way. The competition is very important in evolution. I just want to make the point that cooperation should be seen as standing alongside it. And I do think, like you're saying, that has big implications for the way that we see the world. Because I think scientific thought, I think Darwin, that aspect of Darwin has shaped our thinking a great deal. And I think now we need the counterbalance. Now, about musk and the perfume industry. The name musk, the plant is called musk because that name already exists. in the perfume industry. And the musk itself is gathered, or was gathered, from the anal glands of the musk deer. They're little pods in the, and they had to shoot hundreds of these deer to collect these pods. And this musk was more valuable by weight than gold. And it was used in the perfume industry for two reasons. One, it has its kind of sweetness mixed with a sort of earthiness. It was regarded as quite sexual, to be honest, as a bit of an aphrodisiac. But at the same time, it did serve as a fixative. So other fragrances it was mixed with, it made them last longer. So musk was already a well-known commodity, and it was applied to this plant because because it was said to have that smell. And incidentally, so you're anxious to give some. But one of the things I did in the book was I wanted to know what musk might have smelt like. So I went to try and track down every other plant, wild plant in this country which has musk in its name. Things like the musk mallow and the musk thistle and the musk orchid. And I also went to Kew hunting out musk roses. So I had a great time really exploring different smells.
Just a tiny comment, but my friend here and I, we discovered what we thought was common stalk spill on the top of Park Plainfield, and I sent it to George Townsend, you know him, who's the
Yes, I do.
botanist for London Natural History Society. He came back and said that was musk stalk spill, and it's a bit of a pest, it's taking over now. Now it's completely died, it's incredible, it's this brown patch on the ground there. So there's a musk stalk, but we never actually smelt it to see what musk smells like. That's just a comment, thank you.
Can I say something about that? Because there was a whole section on musk stalkspill in the book. Because while I was seeking out all these plants that had musk in their name, I was looking for musk stalkspill, and I read in the books that it was found mostly on coastal regions in the West Country. So I had a botanist friend from the London Natural History Society, and I arranged a meeting at a cafe for lunch one day, and I hadn't told him what I was going for, but I was going to ask him, what's the best place I can go and find this musk stalkspill? And I went to the cafe and he said, oh, hello Bob, so I got here a bit early and I've been looking around what's about. There's only some musk stalkspill just outside on the step. And now that I am attuned to it, it is everywhere. And when I walk the dog, I find whole lawns now, and estate lawns that are being taken over with this musk